So this week's video is going to be part 2 on how I paint and draw in facial hair using an airbrush and a few different drawing tools. All of the preliminary stuff is in last week's video, which I'm linking up on the screen right now. And just as a reminder, I'm using Schmincke Aero colors for this one. I'm using a black colored pencil, a 2B graphite pencil, and of course an X-Acto blade to cut into the paint. So let's just pick this one right up from where we left off in last week's video. And so toward the end of that video, I added in some paint here on the chin. The bone underneath this is called the mandible. That's the jawbone. And I sprayed a little bit more of this paint at the bottom so it's darker, and then less as I moved up. And that of course is called a gradient. It's a transition of value from dark to light or from light to dark. And from here, I'm switching over to the X-Acto blade, and if you notice my grip here, I'm using an overhand grip. I always switch off between the two, the underhand grip, which is like a pencil grip, and the overhand grip now, which is kind of like a long handle paintbrush grip. And so now I'm working on a gessoed surface here. This is a gessoed canvas. And the reason that I prefer this surface is that it has more tooth than some of the other surfaces used in airbrush painting. In other words, it just grips the paint, holds it down a little bit better. It's not as precarious as some of the synthetic papers. And here's the thing that I love about it. If you notice on the left side here where I'm pulling out some hairs, I'm just using a light amount of pressure. And you'll notice that I am removing paint, but I'm not removing all of it. I'm just kind of removing a thin layer. And because some of that paint is still left behind, the hairs aren't extremely bright. It's not cutting down all the way into the gesso. And so now as I move along to the right side, I want to add a few brighter hairs in here. So I'm going to use some more pressure on that X-Acto blade. And you'll notice here that the value of these hairs are much brighter. They're much lighter than the other ones because I'm cutting more of that paint out, exposing some more of that gesso. And in order to pull out different values of paint, it's just something you're going to have to practice. The good news is that there's nothing difficult about it, but it is more of a feel depending on what type of paint you're using and what surface you're working on. So just keep on practicing with it. You'll eventually get that feel for how much pressure you need to use. So what I'm doing here is using a lighter amount of pressure, just focusing on this single part of the beard. I noticed in the reference, and as you can see in my completed painting on this area that I'm circling right here, is that there are some bright hairs within this area, but I always like to work in layers, so I'm slowly building up some of this texture, scratching out a few hairs, knowing that once these are down and a glaze is applied over the top, I could use some more pressure and pull out some brighter ones later on. So I just want to keep working into this area, but as you'll notice in the completed painting, not all the hairs are the same color. There's kind of a mixture here of some black hairs and some gray hairs. So just like I said in last week's video, I am trying to hold back. I'm not just trying to pull out a million of these small bright white hairs. I want to mix here. I want some darker ones and I want some lighter ones. But with that said, I am trying to move the X-Acto blade around pretty loosely and kind of quick just to break up the natural pattern that we find ourselves adding to our paintings or drawings. Now I'm going back to my airbrush again with that black paint, lightly glazing it on just to the left of these hairs that we just pulled out. I want to add some more hairs to the left side and I want some more contrast. It just seemed a little bit too light right now, so a bit more paint so I could scratch into it. And then of course to pull out some hairs in that area, right back over to the X-Acto blade, and this time you're going to see me using a different grip. I'm using an underhand grip here. Basically like holding a pencil, it gives you a lot of control to flick out some very thin lines, but there is a bit of a caveat. This does not cut out well unless you set the burr at the edge of the blade correctly, just using a sharpening stone. So as I work into this area, I'm using a light amount of pressure and you can see that I could pull out some very thin lines with this grip. And they're not that bright just because I'm lightly scratching the paint. It's more like scuffing it rather than really digging into it, removing everything. And you could even see right now in this small section, it's starting to look like facial hair. It's starting to look like a small section of this beard. And of course, this little part that we're working on now is going to blend into everything else. You're not going to see this individual part. You're going to see it as a whole when you look at the entire painting. And so even if I just left it like this as a first layer, it would work fine for most paintings. And it's always going to be up to you as the painter to decide how far you want to push it. And so what I'm going to do is eventually push this a little bit farther. I'm going to glaze some paint on the top, just like I showed in last week's video, and then apply some more scratches and some pencil work on top of it. But before I move along to that, I just want to keep working into this area so I have a fair amount of this texture down before we glaze the paint on top. And I want to be careful here not to pull out all of these hairs in the same direction. And so at the bottom here, you're going to see me pulling out most of these hairs in kind of a vertical motion up and down, but you are going to see me flick out some in some diagonals, some shorter, some longer. Again, just adding to that randomness. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I am playing around with some different pressures here. You'll see me using some very light pressure to pull out some very thin hairs where you barely even notice them. And then a few where I use some more pressure, dig a little bit deeper into that paint, exposing more of the gesso. And because I am working on a pretty heavy canvas, this is 15-ounce cotton duck with that gesso on top. It's very tough. It's very resilient. There's really no way you're going to accidentally damage this surface. You can work into it over and over. I want to show the majority of this video in real time just so you can get a sense of how this actually works. And so for this part, I'm just kind of going over everything again, just with a very light amount of pressure, just pulling out some thin hairs in between the hairs that I pulled out before. And when I'm doing this, you'll notice here that the blade is constantly moving. I'm just moving it up and down, pretty much the same amount of pressure the whole time, just lightly going over everything, pulling out some more of those very thin hairs on top. And some of these are so light that you can barely even see them unless you're looking at the painting really close up. But that small amount of texture really just adds something else to the painting. It makes it look like there's a lot more work going into this than I actually did. And so now before I switch over to the airbrush to glaze the paint on top, I'm using a graphite pencil here. This is a 2B graphite pencil, and I'm just working into some of these areas in between. Within some of these patches, there are a few thin, darker hairs, some flyaway hairs in there, so I'm just sketching them in with a pencil, just a very light impression of them. And then it's time to switch over to the airbrush to glaze some paint on top. And the first thing I'm doing here is adding in some lines, some patches of shadow where there's some dark hairs kind of clumped together within this part of the beard. Once that's done, I'm just focusing on this section right here that I'm circling, just glazing on a very thin amount of this black paint over the top. A small amount is key because black paint gets very dark very quickly. And if you add too much, it's going to cover up all those hairs that you just added in. So what I always like to do is spray a small amount and then take a few steps back from my painting. Just look at it from a distance. And a lot of times when I do that, especially when I'm spraying black paint, is that I'll notice the area got a little bit too darker than I wanted. And so trust me on this, with black paint, less is more. If an area is still too light, it takes a second to spray more paint on top. But if an area gets too dark, you lose all your detail and you have to redo it. So just go nice and light, you'll be fine. And so in this area with the glaze I just applied, it was the right amount of paint for me. You can see that hair is still there, it's just a little bit darker. And so now on top of this, I'm going to come right back in with the X-Acto blade and start layering these hairs on top. This is going to add depth to the beard because those hairs underneath, which are now a little bit darker, are just going to look like they're in the background. And with some of these brighter hairs that I'm scratching in right now, right on top, are going to look like they're closer to us. So we're just adding an illusion in here. And the key to all this is that black paint in the background that allows us to scratch into it. And that also makes it look like the area farthest away in the darkest shadow. Up on top and to the left here where I want a few of these hairs brighter, just using more pressure on the blade. You can see that removes more paint so they look brighter. And if you do hold the edge of that blade a bit flatter against the canvas, you can pull out a few of these lines just a little bit thicker. I'll show you an example here right in the center of the beard. I'm holding the blade a little bit flatter. It's kind of tough to see on video, but more of that blade is making contact with that gessoed canvas. So when I pull off the paint, it's just a bit wider than it is before. And if I want a few of these lines a little bit thinner, I will angle the X-Acto blade up. That way the tip of the blade is just making contact with the canvas, removing a thin line of paint. A simple analogy to the line thickness is kind of like drawing with a graphite pencil. If you want a wider line, you hold that pencil a little bit flatter to draw. That way more of the graphite is making contact with the paper. And if you want a sharper line, you hold the edge of the pencil more perpendicular to the surface that you're drawing on. That way you're just using the tip of the graphite. Now, of course, scratching out paint with an X-Acto blade is very different than drawing with a graphite pencil, but I think that analogy just helps to explain this concept a bit better. And honestly, the only way you're really going to learn this is just by sitting down and doing it, practicing, making those mistakes, and learning from them. And I think that's really the only way to learn drawing or painting. You can listen to people talk about it or give examples or demos all day long. You're not going to learn it until you really sit down and do it. And just remember that mistakes, even though, yeah, they're going to be annoying, they're going to be extremely frustrating, they're really the best teachers. So a few more passes here with that X-Acto blade and then right back over to the airbrush to glaze the paint over the top. And you can see I'm spraying more of this paint toward the bottom where the mandible, the jawbone starts to kind of roll away. And within the beard itself, I'm just spraying in some darker patches of this black paint. And then it's just rinse and repeat, same process over and over again until I'm happy with the final results. And so that's going to be it for this week's video. That's 2 parts on how I paint and draw facial hair. I hope you try some of these techniques out for yourself. And one final thing that I want to mention here is if you notice some areas being a little bit too dark, you could use a soft eraser like you'll see me using here, and then just very lightly make a pass over some of those darker areas with the softer eraser. That's going to remove a very small amount of paint and lighten the area up. And the nice thing about a soft eraser is that it doesn't add that much texture. So I do hope that you guys enjoyed this one, maybe pick something up. Thank you so much for watching. And of course, before I go, thank you so much for the generous support of the current channel members who really help keep this channel going. I'd like to welcome Letter, the newest member at a very generous tier 3. That's really nice of you. Thank you so much and welcome. I hope everyone's well. I hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you back here next Friday.